I grew up in a small town of about 10,000 people. When I was just out of high school, I was working at one of the gas stations, and it was close to the house where I was living at the time. The gas station was near a major highway, so it was pretty busy with drivers from the road, even in the late hours. I was working the late shift, which was 6 p.m. until 2 in the morning, and I had been doing it for about a year at the time of this incident. At around 5:45, I headed out from my house and walked to work. It was only a 15-minute walk, so I never bothered driving. When I got there, one of my coworkers took off for the night. One good thing about my work is that it's busy enough that there were always two of us on duty. I've heard stories about people working alone all night, but to me that sounds too scary. It's always safer to have someone else there. That night, it was me and Jacob working late. For the first few hours, not much happened. Jacob and I got along well, but he was in his 40s and we weren't quite friends, so it was all work. I was covering the cash for the most part that night. Behind the counter, we had several computer screens with feeds from the cameras that were covering the inside and outside of the gas station. Shoplifters are a constant problem for anyone in a place like this, so that was a big part of my job. I would catch one or two of them most nights. At around midnight, two people walked into the store. I was behind the counter, and Jacob was in the back somewhere. Both of them were average height, but they looked pretty rough. One of them had a large tattoo on his face, and he walked away from the counter. The other one walked up to the counter and started talking to me. As soon as I looked at his face, I thought that he was on drugs. I can't say what specifically, but something about him was off. One other thing that was strange was that I didn't see their car. They definitely weren't at a pump, and our parking lot was visible from either the window or from the security cameras. These guys didn't seem to have a car, and I knew they weren't locals because I would have recognized them. The one who came to the counter started asking me random questions, just small talk mostly, but he came off as friendly. I knew what they were doing right away because it's a common scam. Two guys walk in, one of them distracts me and the other steals from the store. It was obvious, so while this guy was talking to me, I was actually watching the other on the screen to my left. It didn't take long before I saw him steal some things. He stuffed some candy bars and some beef jerky into his jacket, and he was right on camera. After another minute, the thief came up to the counter, trying to buy 2 energy drinks. As soon as he placed the cans on the counter, I confronted him for stealing. He denied it at first, then I told him I had it on camera. I pointed to our monitors and said the cameras cover the whole store. After that, both guys exploded and started yelling at me. They were angry and getting in my face. Seconds later, Jacob came out to back me up. The two guys were screaming at this point, but Jacob didn't care. He was an older guy, and he had seen it all before. One of the guys tried getting in his face, but Jacob didn't flinch. They were trying to intimidate him, but it wasn't working. They must have seen that they couldn't bully us, and eventually, the thief took the stuff out from his jacket, and then they turned to leave. Before they could, though, I stopped them again. I thought that he hadn't given it all back, so I told Jacob. He told the guys that they could either put it all back or that he'd call the cops. Finally, he emptied his jacket of the last 2 candy bars. Then we made him turn it inside out before we would let them leave. They were so pissed off that I could hear them utter a few threats under their breath as they left. Once they were gone, I watched them on the outdoor cameras for as long as I could. They seemed to leave on foot, which confirmed what I thought before. They didn't have a car nearby. I didn't worry about that at the time, and then I went back to work after Jacob and I had a laugh about the ridiculousness of what just happened. A good public freakout is always good for breaking up the boredom of a long night. This one, however, would lead to a pretty horrible incident. Jacob took off at 1 in the morning, and then I was on until 2, but another of our coworkers came in. When my shift was finally done, I stepped out into the night, ready to get home and go to bed. Like I said before, it was only a 15-minute walk, and I had done that walk many times. The way back was a well-lit sidewalk, and it was lined with mostly apartment buildings. When I was about halfway home, I was grabbed from behind. I turned around to see what was happening, but whoever it was had a tight grip on me. I was struggling, but it didn't do much good. I was then dragged into an alley between 2 of the apartment buildings on the street. It was dark, but there was a dim light on one of the buildings, just enough so I could see. Eventually, I got a glimpse of my attackers, and it was the 2 guys from earlier who had tried to rob the store. I knew right away what was happening. They wanted revenge. They roughed me up for a few minutes, landing a few punches. My nose was bleeding pretty bad. I dropped to the ground, pretending that the beating affected me worse than it did. I thought they might leave me alone if they thought I was more hurt. They seemed to stop, so I was kind of relieved, but then I looked up at them. Blood was dripping down my face. The one with the face tattoo was looking down at me, and then he pulled a handgun and pointed it right at me. The other one was laughing slightly. I put my hands up as if to block the shot, but I know that doesn't make much sense. He held the gun on me for what felt like forever, then he lowered it for a moment. Just when I was feeling relieved, he raised it again, and then pulled the trigger. I honestly thought I was going to die right there, but the gun wasn't loaded. It clicked, but nothing happened. Then the two of them burst out laughing at me. I lay there feeling defeated until they finally left. As soon as I was sure they were really gone, I got up and ran home, looking behind me to make sure I wasn't being followed. I did call the cops when I got home, and they came to talk to me about it. Even though they were on camera at the gas station, they were never found. I would have thought the police could find them, especially since one of them had a face tattoo, but that didn't happen. I think they were just some thugs passing through our town, and they made it out in time. Their car was not on camera, so the license plate was not known. My guess is that they parked somewhere around the corner to avoid being seen. I had to let this one go, but it was definitely the worst near-death experience of my life. Even though they were probably never planning to kill me, I was almost sure I was going to die, and I will never forget that feeling. I live in Las Vegas, even though I'm from California. Most of my family still lives in my hometown, and I go to visit quite often. Since it's not that far, I drive instead of fly. That means taking a road trip through the desert. Although I like the drive, it can be kind of scary due to the isolation. It was 7 in the evening, and I was on the road alone. My car is kind of a piece of crap because I couldn't afford a better one. It had been reliable enough in the past, but I knew it had some problems. It had overheated once recently, and things were only getting worse. Anyway, as I was driving, it broke down and I pulled over to the side of the highway. As soon as I grabbed for my phone, I saw that the battery was dead. Without a car adapter, I had no way to charge it. My car was well stocked for an emergency like this, so I wasn't that worried. I had a 2-gallon jug of water and some food that I had stashed away. Still, I was hoping for help before that would be necessary. As the hours ticked by, I started to worry that nobody would come. There had been a few cars passing each hour, but none of them stopped. I guess nobody wanted to take a chance on an old beat-up car in the middle of nowhere at night. Can't say I blame them. It was almost 11 p.m. and pitch dark, and I was all alone. Finally, a set of headlights pulled up next to me, and a car pulled over. The driver, a middle-aged man, rolled down his window and asked if I needed help. He offered me a ride, mentioning the lack of cell service made it impossible for him to call for help. I thought the area had service, but I don't know who his provider was. Getting into his car, I noticed the smell of alcohol right away. It was clear that he had been drinking. My alarm bells were ringing, but what choice did I have? I sure didn't want to spend the night in my car. We drove in silence for a while, and it was awkward. The nearest town shouldn't have been that far away, though. We had hardly said a word to each other, then he offered me some cocaine. I couldn't even see where he got it from, but he tossed a small plastic bag onto my lap. I didn't even know what to do. I thought I should just pretend to do some, and then he would think I was cool, but I didn't. I tried to refuse politely instead. His mood shifted after that. He became angry and told me to get out. I honestly didn't think he would care so much if I did some, but maybe I insulted him. He was obviously messed up on something, so maybe he wasn't thinking straight. He was definitely not someone who I thought should be driving anyway, but I was hoping I could get into town and call for help. After he pulled over the car, I tried to apologize, hoping he would change his mind, but it was too late. I got out of the car and stood on the side of the road, but the man didn't drive off. He looked at me and pulled out a gun. He pointed it right at me. I stood there for a whole minute, with this wasted guy threatening me. Finally, he put the gun down and drove ahead about 50 yards. Then he put the car into reverse and started speeding back towards me. At first, I thought he had changed his mind and decided to come back and give me a ride, as if I would get back into that car. As he got closer, though, the car didn't slow. Then it swerved towards me on the shoulder of the road. He was trying to run me over. I dodged out of the way just in time and watched him almost drive off the road into the ditch. I ran back, hoping he wouldn't be able to see me in the dark. I thought that he would come over for another try, but he didn't bother. I watched the car drive away, swerving between the two lanes. With that, I was alone again in the dark, miles away from my broken down car. The walk back was long, and I was half expecting the car to come back and kill me, but I didn't see him again or any other car on my way. It took me until around 1 in the morning to get back to my car. Exhausted, I collapsed into the driver's seat and managed to get a few hours of crappy sleep. When the sun came up, I sat in my car and waited. A couple hours later, an older guy in a work truck stopped. He offered me help and gave me a ride to the nearest town. From there, I was able to get the help I needed and deal with the car, then finally get out of the desert. After I was out of there, I did call to report the man who had tried to run me over. I don't think they ever did anything about it though, because the police never told me anything. There are bad drivers all over the place, and people driving wasted. I knew that happened, but it takes a special kind of jerk to do what he did. He almost killed me, and I won't be surprised if he gets someone else, either by accident or on purpose. When I was growing up, I lived with my mom and my younger brother Garrett. He was 12 at the time, and I was 16. Our parents had divorced when I was 10, but our dad lived less than 5 minutes away, so we saw him often. Our house was 2 stories, and it was attached to another house on one side, so I guess it was a duplex. The neighbor in the other house was an old guy who we didn't know very well. There was a narrow driveway on one side of the house, but no garage. My mom would park her car on the driveway, so it was always super hot in the summer from being exposed like that. One night, my brother and my mom went over to her friend's house to watch a movie. They invited me, but I was really obsessed with StarCraft 2 at the time, and I wanted to stay home and play. My mom said that was okay, so after dinner, they headed out and I was all alone in our house. My room was upstairs, and that's where I had my gaming set up. I'd been playing for hours when my mom called. It was almost midnight by then. She said they were going to be staying over because it was so late already. I said that was fine, because I didn't mind being alone for the night. I played until 2 in the morning, and I finally decided to go to bed. When I got under the covers, I didn't fall asleep right away because I was used to staying up late. I should mention that it was summer vacation, so I didn't have to get up for school in the morning. I stared at the ceiling of my room, trying to fall asleep. I even considered getting up to play another hour or 2 on my computer, but I didn't. Suddenly, a sound came from downstairs. It was the soft click of the back door being opened. It was really late, and nobody was supposed to come home. Not yet. I reached for my phone, which was right next to my bed, and I scrolled down to my mom's number. Before I called, I realized that my mom was almost an hour away. That wouldn't do much good, so I called my dad instead, hoping he would still be awake. He answered on the first ring. His voice was groggy, but I was happy that he answered. I whispered into my phone, "Someone's in the house." "Stay in your room. Lock the door. I'm on my way," he said. I did as I was told, and then pushed my dresser against the door in a clumsy attempt to barricade myself in. Then I waited. I could just barely hear somebody in the house on the ground floor. There was no doubt that somebody had broken in, but I didn't know what they wanted. My dad lived close, but those minutes stretched out while I was waiting. It was silent other than the sound of footsteps. All I could do was wait there, hoping that he wouldn't find me, but I could hear him coming up the stairs. He was coming up, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. I was in the closet, peeking through the cracks into my room, which was almost completely dark. Eventually, the intruder made his way to the top of the stairs. It seemed like he went into every room but mine, maybe because mine was the only one with the door closed. Eventually, I heard him turn my doorknob. I could hear him trying to open the door, but the dresser that I had moved in front was making it hard. It wouldn't be long before he got in, though, so I was terrified. Just in time, the police arrived. I could hear them come in the front door and up the stairs. When it was finally safe to come out, my dad was there with the cops. He must have gotten there around the same time, because I know he would have saved me if he was there sooner. I didn't see the intruder in person, but before they left, the cops requested our security camera footage. We had a motion sensor camera on the front porch. They pretty much caught him red-handed anyway, but I guess it would still help for something. When I saw the footage for the first time, I found out that the intruder was our next-door neighbor, but that wasn't the creepiest part. When he came into our house, he was holding a gun. Obviously, he was arrested that night, and was also kicked out of the house next door to us. We think that he had been planning this for a while, because he never took anything from the house. He came straight up the stairs, and I think he was looking for me. I may be reading too much into this, but I think that he was waiting for a night when he knew I would be alone. My mom's car was usually in the driveway, so since it was not there, he would have known or at least suspected that I would be alone. It seems pretty clear that he was coming to kill me, and at 34 years old, this is still the closest I've ever come to death. This happened almost 20 years ago, but it's still the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. I was 23 years old and living on my own in a rented room in a large city. I was working in an auto shop and going to school part-time. My house was split up between 4 roommates, 2 of which were my friends from high school. The other was a foreign student who kept to himself, but he was nice whenever we saw him. I worked long hours during the day and didn't get off until 7 p.m. Most of the time when I got home, I couldn't relax, so I'd often go for a run in the park near our place. I headed out one night at around 9 p.m. The park was only a 15-minute jog, and when I got there, I could see the large gate at the front near the street. I went in and did a few laps. There were lights throughout, but it was dark otherwise. The park was a mixture of paved and gravel paths, and there were a few people walking around and hanging out there. Once I was about ready to head back home, I saw a man standing on the sidewalk near the large gate at the front of the park. I was heading back to the street, so in no time, I was right near the man. Once I was about 20 feet away, he raised his right hand to wave at me. I stopped and then looked behind me, thinking he was looking at somebody else, but there was nobody there. I looked back to the man, and he was definitely looking and waving at me, so I waved back tentatively. That was when I could see that he was waving me over. At that point, it was still only 9:30, and there were people around. It was dark, but I didn't feel scared or worried about stranger danger. I thought the man needed help, so I went over to see what he wanted. When I got closer to him, I could see that he was a younger guy, probably only a few years older than me, maybe early 30s at the most. He had a dark gray jacket and blue jeans, and wore a red baseball hat, a pretty generic-looking man. I walked up to him, and he greeted me with a smile. Then he explained that he was from out of town, and had gotten lost on his way back to the highway. I tried to explain how to get there, but admittedly, my instructions came off kind of confusing. This was the early 2000s, so although a lot of people had cell phones, it was not so easy to pull up directions. After a few minutes of trying to explain it to him, the man asked me to come with him and show me where it was. He pointed to his car, a small hatchback that was parked on the street nearby. That request creeped me out right away, even though the man seemed nice and genuine. He promised to take me back right as soon as I showed him where the on-ramp was, but I was not getting into that stranger's car. I told him that I was sorry, but that I couldn't do it. He seemed to take it all right, and then I turned to walk away. My memory is hazy after this next bit, but this is what I think happened. After I was a few steps away, I was attacked from behind. He must have drugged me with something, because the next thing I remember is waking up in his moving car. I was in the passenger seat, and when I looked out the window, I was on a remote country road that I didn't recognize. We were in the city before, and would have taken at least a half hour to get into an area like this. I knew I was in bad trouble, but I didn't know what to do. I had opened my eyes, but I hadn't moved otherwise, and I didn't think my captor knew I was awake. Not wanting him to know that, I stayed still. I only opened my right eye to see. At that point, I still didn't have a plan, and I could hardly keep from screaming out for help. The drive went on like that for another 15 or 20 minutes, when I saw a set of headlights coming towards us in the other lane on the road. I knew this was my chance. I thought that if I could get his attention, then he might call for help. I wanted to swerve off the road and make sure the other driver saw it. So with a swift motion, I sprung up and grabbed the steering wheel of the car, then jerked it to the right. The man fought with me, and then we swerved to the left into the other lane. That other car grazed the side of our car, and then we spun off into the ditch. I hit my head on the dashboard when we crashed, and I almost passed out again, but I managed to stay awake. When I turned to look back, I saw a man approaching the car. It seemed to be the driver of the other car. I looked over to the driver's seat, and the man who had kidnapped me had fled the car. I looked around, but didn't see where he went. There were some woods around there, so maybe he went in there to hide. The other driver was understandably pissed off. We almost killed him too, but I was way too relieved to feel guilty at that moment. He called the police, and they were on the scene within 10 minutes. They talked to the other driver first, then they came to me. I admitted to causing the accident, but told them what happened to me that night. As soon as I told them my story, they called for backup because there was a dangerous man on the loose. I was taken to the hospital for my injuries, and also for whatever drugs I was given earlier. Before I left the hospital, I found out that my kidnapper was caught near the crash site. As I thought, he was hiding nearby, but without a vehicle, there wasn't anywhere he could go. I was allowed to go home that evening because my injuries were not serious. As I reflect on what happened that night, I truly believe that I would have been killed if I hadn't made the move that I did. There's no ending to that story that doesn't end up with me dead. That guy was definitely a serial killer in the making, and I could have been his first victim.